I want to say thank you, Louisville. You've been extraordinary hosts. I've had the opportunity to spend 3 days with you, and it is clear that you are an inspired city. This is a spiritual city. And sitting here amongst you, you can feel the great oneness that holds you. So thank you very much for your hospitality. And Fetzer, Bob, thank you. You have been courageous, first out of the blocks in many culture-changing initiatives. Your lead foot is always the truth, and we're grateful for that. I am wondering who here is a grandparent. Fantastic. And who here is, and there'll be some overlap, of course, a parent. Yes, yes. How about a teacher, counselor, or youth leader? Fantastic. So you have had the blessing, the gift of being witness to a spiritual child. Actually, show your hands there. Yes. And I'm going to share with you a story of one who came into our lives. Many years ago, although it's gone in a flash, my husband and I, after a road of trials, found our spiritual child. He was beautiful, he was soulful, he was in a little crib north of St. Petersburg, Russia. In a tiny town, we're getting very close to the North Pole there. And upon seeing us, he looked up, and his eyes said, "Da, yes." And that is our boy, Isaiah. And Isaiah came home, and from the get-go, we wanted him to know the great gift that he is to us. As anyone knows who's traveled the world to find your spiritual child, whether it's down the block or many countries away, it is a pilgrimage. It is a sacred pilgrimage, like going to Mecca or Jerusalem. It is a very sacred quest. And we wanted him to know just that. And so starting from the time he was very young, we said, Isaiah, let's tell the story of finding Isaiah. And he loved this story. We'd say, you know, Isaiah, Grandpa prayed for Isaiah, and Grandma prayed for Isaiah, and Daddy and Mommy prayed for Isaiah. Everybody prayed for Isaiah. But then we took, I think 18 months, a train to a plane, to an automobile. And we jumped out of the automobile, and we ran up the hill, and there was Isaiah. And we'd throw him in the air, and it was the Finding Isaiah celebration. He loved this. Until it got a little old, he set Thomas the train aside, and the locomotion was no longer arresting to him. And we moved on to a story that gripped him dearly, which was Isaiah loved nature. Isaiah played in the river. Isaiah loved the geese and the ducks. And so we said, Isaiah, now he's about 4, you are our baby Moses. You came down the river to us. You're our special baby Moses. And he would say, yes, I am baby Moses. Fast forward, Isaiah is now 8. And I'm driving along, and as grandparents and parents and youth leaders, you know where everything happens when you're driving along. Right? It's the back seat, and I hear psh, 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 psh. Seated with his best buddy, he says, Mama, Johnny says, you are not my mother. My name is not Miller, and I am not Jewish. And I said, but Isaiah, big breath, don't you remember? And he's like, oh, yes. And he whips around to his best buddy, and he says, I am baby Moses. And his friend, unfamiliar with the story, said, what? And he said, I'm baby Moses. And I said, what? And he said, never mind, by which he meant, you simply just don't understand. But then it got a little tougher. And I was faced with a challenge I'd not anticipated. Mama, Johnny says, someone gave me up. Why'd that woman give me up? And here, I have very dear friends who never found a good answer to that question, so I took a big breath. And another big breath, and then I heard, oh, I know. God whispered in her ear and said that you were crying for me. The child is a knower. Right? Your child is a knower. And when we share the journey through life as a sacred journey, knowing the turns and the twists from a spiritual perspective, the child is equipped to do the same when faced with the big questions and the tough moments in life. I share with you the story of Isaiah as a form of witness, right? As a scientist, when we look at a chorus of children or a chorus of parents and families, that is another form of witness. Right? And so I'll share with you 3 major sets of findings that we now have from over 20 years of very good, top-shelf, peer-reviewed science that sheds light on stories such as this, perhaps in your own home or your own faith community or your own school, that the child is indeed, from day one, a spiritual child. That if we support this deep capacity, they are fortified in developing a powerful spiritual core. And that when we do this together, there is nothing as parents, grandparents, teachers, counselors, and youth leaders we can do as profoundly protective against the greatest forms of suffering and foundational to thriving in our children's lives. So let's take the first point. The child is a spiritual child. How do we know that? Through the lens of science, we can determine whether any trait is innate or socialized. IQ is about half and half innate, half socialized. Temperament is about 60% innate, which, as people who know children, you know well. No 2 babies come out alike. The capacity through which we experience spiritual life, within or without of a faith tradition, across all faith traditions, the deep, innate capacity through which we experience the sacred, the transcendent awareness is 1/3 socialized, 1/3 innate, 2/3 socialized, which means 1/3 innate, every one of us is born a spiritual child. 2/3 socialized, you have an enormous impact on the cultivation of the spiritual core. How we live our lives side by side, our children, determines what, by the time they are 18, the world will look like. Will they look with an open heart onto a foundationally spiritual world, or will they feel isolated and separated in a meaningless universe? That is in our hands. Every child is born a spiritual child. Finding 2, with puberty, biological puberty, this capacity surges. And this you know well. What is my meaning? What is my purpose? Actually, what is the meaning, the purpose? Perhaps there's none. And if we take that seriously, the felt sense that maybe in the developmental path there's a window where we don't know if there's meaning, we have nothing but the deepest respect for supporting spiritual growth through puberty. How do we know that? With biological puberty is a 50% increase in the heritable contribution to spiritual life. Finding 3, when we support innate spiritual development in adolescence, the spiritual core is formed that is integrated with all other lines of development. So moral choices are not cherry-picked, but rather derived from a deep sense of connection to the higher power, God, Allah, Hashem, the universe, nature, the deep source of life in us, through us, and around us. When that happens, the protective benefits against the most prevalent forms of suffering are greater than that known by any other factor in clinical or social sciences. A teen who says, I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. Nature is a sacred home. My family carries deep spiritual meaning to me. That teen is 80% less likely to become addicted to substances as compared to a teen who says, I don't know what you're talking about. Right? That teen is 60% less likely to have recurrent major depression. Every teen gets depressed, but the potholes in life that derail us and take us from otherwise normative development can be prevented by building the spiritual core. Why? Ken Kendler and his team found that with each successive little depressive episode, the trip cord gets lower. So if I am broken up with, if I fail a test, I have a choice about what to make of that. And I can say, you know what? I am such a loser. Nobody likes me. Right? That type of attribution, that type of thinking sets me up to really be even more depressed next time. But if I say, you know what, I can learn from this. There's a path here. And facing a major loss, if I can say, I know God walks by my side, there is a meaning to this diversion in my path that I didn't expect that will open another door. If I can cultivate a spiritual response to big losses and suffering, then rather than developing a lower tripcord to the next unfortunate and unwanted event, I actually build, much by way of metaphor, my muscle to handle the heavier load in life. Right? So what do we know? Every child's a spiritual child. With puberty, there's a surge, an extraordinary opportunity to fortify this natural capacity. And if we do, there is nothing in the clinical or social sciences as profoundly protective against anxiety, depression, substance abuse. We face an epidemic of suicide. Right? I've been invited to Palo Alto. Well, there's now a train track that is barriered from the street with a fence. Because if you can delay for 2 minutes a teen from taking his or her life, they're unlikely to do it. Right? To Rye, New York, there's a host of communities that are taking back their culture. They're taking back their school culture, their parent culture, and they're infusing it with the deep form of awareness, what we're calling an awakened awareness, a connectivity and a support for this innate spiritual core in every child that will prevent those children from facing the abyss without a spiritual response. And this is in our hands, 2/3 socialized. Now, who are we? Let's stand over here. That's our spiritual child. Who are we, and how do we do this work? It's not by picking up 4 different books on religion and philosophy in college that a child awakens necessarily to the spiritual path. And in fact, what college counselors tell me is 2/3 of my caseload is not psychopathology. It's unsupported struggle. It's existential emptiness without a spiritual response, without the deep inner core there to handle life. Well, the data is quite clear that in making the spiritual child, that is the 2/3 socialized part of the spiritual child, there's an equal contribution from our own transparency on our spiritual path by their side, and from our embodiment as parents, grandparents, educators, and youth leaders, our embodiment of spiritual values, love, unconditional love, seeing you truly for who you are, not as an A or a C, not as my kid who just won the game or just was benched, but seeing you more deeply as a soul on earth, as a child of infinite worth. Our embodiment of spiritual values plus our transparency creates the lived ecology of harvesting this natural gift, the innate spirituality. So what does this look like? I'll give you an example. I had a deeply religious and spiritual mother who prayed out loud, who would cry and say how beautiful the sunset, what a gift from God. Thank you, God, for my children, as she'd look at each of us, and tears would come to her eyes as she would pray and view every single moment of life as a sacred event. And I had an equally loving, as equally powerfully an embodiment of spiritual values in my father, who was quite a skeptic and would read plays on the back porch, a professor of the performing arts. But it was my father who, on the very day after his mother passed, on the awakening very early that morning at about 5 a.m., came down, sat by my side on the carpet, and said, you know, in a very raw and unmetabolized way, Grandma, she came to me last night in my dream. It'd been one day. And Grandma loved to dress up. She wore beautiful clothes and pretty jewelry, but in this dream, said my father, Grandma was wearing an everyday gray suit. And she was walking by my side down Grand Avenue in Des Moines, Iowa, where my father had grown up with his mother. And he said, you know, I take this to mean that Grandma had always walked by my side. She would always be my mother and continue to walk by my side, that Grandma is with me. It was pure and clear. And to this day, that is the register of my relationship with my father. And to this day, I am certain that our ancestors walk with us, not because of my 20 years of the scientific look, but because deep in my knowing, in my inner wisdom, my father told me so. Right? This is who we are. There is no one in the world who can take your place in supporting our spiritual children. Now, we do not need to be perfect, and I will be the first to say, I, as a parent, am very full of love and very full of error. And still, this can be fixed. So if I were to take an example of transparency and embodiment brought to a not-so-bright moment, here with you, very gracious people, I will give a modest example. Driving along in a grumpy mood, honking at traffic, perhaps discourteous, which is more embarrassing to the barista at Starbucks. I've been really grumpy and not so good today, right? And the worst part of all is I've basically ignored the back seat. So at the end of the day, the sun is setting, and I look back, and I pull over, and I say, you know, Mommy's sorry, because really, you're the most important thing in my life, and I feel that I wasn't really present today, so I want to apologize to you. I'm trying to fix it, human to human. And then, the great presence in us, through us, and around us. Will you join me in a prayer or a meditation or a walk in nature where we thank God for today? And I would like to ask for forgiveness, because today was a gift, and I think I squandered it. And in this moment, the child knows that things can be fixed, not just between us, but in the sacred journey we share side by side. And if they can fix that, they can fix the losses and the pains that come and put us at risk for anxiety, depression, and substance abuse, even suicide. There is a spiritual response, and we teach it on the road of life, side by side. So this is who we are. This is our great honor. And ultimately, what would the science say? We are ambassadors. So thank you.
Richie, I'm thinking there are profound connections between your work and Lisa's.
Yes.
I wondered if you might like to reflect on that.
Sure. First, thank you for bringing awareness to this dimension of child development that has been, I think, impoverished in the academy until your work came along. And so calling attention to it, I think, is really the first important thing to do to help nourish these qualities. I love the framework that you develop in thinking about the nurturing of spiritual qualities as really something that can be done upstream, a kind of preventative strategy to promote a kind of developmental trajectory that will buffer a child from the kind of adversities that children face these days with bullying, substance abuse, those kinds of issues. And I think that this is something that where there's correlational evidence, and I think now we're poised to begin to actually develop even stronger kind of evidence where spiritual qualities can be promoted in children to then see what the prophylactic effect of that development is as the children age, as the children develop in longitudinal studies. And so I think that this is really an exciting and vibrant area which I'm just grateful to you, Lisa, for bringing attention to. So thank you.
Yes, a big thank you for a wonderful presentation. And I know you all were having a lunchtime conversation about a subject I wish I could have been in on. And one way to open it up is to say all of us I know are familiar with the broad-scale adoption by schools, public and private, of the idea of social and emotional learning. And what I'm beginning to hear on a number of fronts is that that field has reached a point where there's an openness to going deeper, and maybe it becomes social, emotional, and spiritual learning. Do you see that possibility?
It's a wonderful point. Beautiful, really culture-changing work has indeed been done by character ed and social emotional learning. Beautiful work. And we are hearing from colleagues, hey, would you like to join us? We see a desire and need to go deeper. The spiritual core makes immediate sense to people. Sometimes to do this in a way that is inclusive and constitutional, we might speak of the awakened core. And there's enormous hunger and interest. So we took the approach at Teachers College and working together with you and many schools across the country, that master educators who've spent thousands of hours in aggregate trying to support this core, who oftentimes went into education feeling called to support the deep core of the child, already had some answers. And with your tremendous help, we engaged in 2 years of field study. We got out of our basic science lab, where we knew where all the gadgets were, and we went into the field and really bared witness to how master educators were setting the culture and the climate of their schools. What were they doing to support the natural spirituality in children? And we found, whether we were looking in a public school, a private school, an under-resourced school, a highly resourced school, schools of all different ethnicities, there were at least 8 common dimensions that we were able to distill. Among them, a language to describe inner life and our relationship to the greater field of life, practices of awareness and connection. There was a view of each day as we come here, what are we doing? Are we teaching math? Are we teaching the child? Right? Loving and seeing that child to the core. Those are examples of deep, deliberate acts of culture and climate that a school can adopt. And we're now working with the Collaborative for Spirituality and Education to join with interested schools who want to be part of a self-reflection and transformation process along those axes.
Yeah, it's tremendously important, exciting work, and we'll come back to it later in our conversation. But before we move on, I want to do a shout out to 2 Louisvillians who have been critical in supporting your effort, Frank Peabody and David Woods. I know you're out there. I think you're out there. And I think we're always looking around for matches that are made in heaven and need to be consummated. And I think the connection between your work and the Compassionate Schools Initiative here is so clear that I hope you all can find a way to come together.
We'd be delighted. That's beautiful work going on here in Louisville.